I'm so happy to welcome today to Beyond Borders my co host, Judy Talaugon, and our very special guest, Olga Kavran. Olga is a fellow at the University of Brussels, completing a PhD on the topic of international criminal courts' obligation to provide information to the public, and she's the founding director of JUSTICOM, established in 2021 as the first non governmental organization dedicated to communicating justice. We love to talk about that around here, all of those things. And I would like to turn it over to my mentor and teacher and colleague,
Thank
Judy
you.
Talaugon.
My goodness. Thank you, Martha, and welcome, Olga. This is for me, and oh, absolutely. We have a publication that just came out that is just obsessed with tribunals and obsessed with the critique and the question of, are we at the place any longer where we really need to redefine what does world court, what does criminal crimes against humanity, the question and the ongoing debate on what genocide is. We have real genocide scholars. We have real, jurists among us. So I wanted to say that, that we, and I will get a publication to you both. East Wind Books is going
That's
to get us.
Tribunal Rising,
Yes,
or
yes.
Tribunal Rising, I should say.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll go Olga one of those publications from my students. But I'm saying this because there's been an ongoing dialogue on tribunals and world courts and criminal crimes against humanity. And in that, I wanted to say how much I appreciate the lineage of that dialogue brought into this interview today. Uh, I feel like you are part of that discourse, um, just intergenerationally almost. For us Indigenous folks, those who've been working in international law have been really all we've ever had to survive to this point, to build an argument. So, Olga, your career spans nearly three, decades across international criminal tribunals. From the early days of the ICTY to leading outreach and legacy at the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and now your work on courts' obligations to inform the public. From your vantage point, what does justice actually require of institutions once the courtroom doors close? And who do you believe justice is ultimately for?
Hmm. Wow, well, that's something we could probably talk about for days.
Yeah.
And I think that, people will define justice differently. We have to be aware of that fact. I've come across that, as you mentioned, I've been working in this field for the past almost, 30 years or more. And what you find is, of course, the way that different victims would define justice at different times in different situations is also going to be defined by their experience and what they've been through, right? So for somebody, justice is obviously nobody will bring back those who are gone, right? Justice is to have a roof over their head, to have woods, right? For somebody else, justice is to see the perpetrators behind bars. And for others, it is those things and other things besides. So it's really, you talk about justice in the sense of whether we call it with a small j, perhaps, is a more general term. This is something that will really depend on the personal experiences, and those have to be taken into consideration. When we talk about justice, arguably with the j, if we say that justice in terms of criminal justice, then things are much more simple in a way. And what I mean by that is that in a criminal justice system, you have definitions, right? You've got crimes which have been defined, These things, of course, can evolve and change and do change over time. So I'm not saying this is something that's fixed and it's like that forever. But they certainly, at a moment in time that we capture, they are defined. And that is the whole point of legality, right? Just crimes must be defined in the law. Nobody can be held responsible for something that was not prohibited by law at the time that they committed it. This is a general principle of legality for any of us, for any crime, right? So justice with a big J is arguably simpler because we've got crimes. So, for example, genocide is a very clearly defined crime in international and national law. Is the definition as we have it with the national, ethnic, religious or group as the main target? Is the definition that we have today adequate? A lot of people would argue that it isn't. But this is something that we have to work with because this is the definition that we have in the Genocide Convention that dates back to 1949, which has been adopted in all the international criminal tribunals and the International Criminal Court. This is the definition all national courts that apply international criminal law as well use. So this is the definition we have to work with, and it's very precise. It's very complex in a way because it requires a very specific intent, and it's arguably, in my view, the most abused word without understanding. And I'll give you an example which is humorous in a dark sort of way, and this is back from the 90s, at the end of the war or after the end of the war in Bosnia. A TV station went to interview an old lady in a village in a rural area of Bosnia about her day-to-day life. And she was working on the land, and she had a chicken coop and other domestic animals, and this was her life. And so the interviewer came in and said, "So how are things going? How are you faring with the situation?" and so forth. Not connected to the war at all. The war had ended a couple of years previously. And what did she said? Everything is fine except for last night, because last night a fox came into the chicken coop and committed genocide. And this, to me, is just an example of different ways in which people, and this is not to belittle anybody, it's just to say this is a word that this woman had heard so many times. She understood the basic gist of it, but she applied it in her own situation, right? Which is arguably amusing, but it's also telling of a way in which people simply misunderstand the term, right? And so what happens because of that is that it's used when it's supposed to be used, and it's used when it's not really supposed to be used. And then the downside of that is that people who, for example, crimes against, again, going back to a situation in the 90s, the crimes committed against people of Kosovo by the Serbian forces at that time cannot fall, for a whole set of reasons that have been established since then in terms of facts. They cannot fall under genocide. Does that make them any less of a crime? Well, no, because these were terrible crimes against humanity, persecutions that were committed against people. But somehow when you say, yes, okay, but it doesn't reach the level of genocide, what is implied is that sentence, that crime is not important enough, right? And that's not what it's meant to be. When it says it doesn't reach the level of genocide, it simply means it hasn't reached all the conditions necessary for genocide to have been occurred, or for somebody to be charged with it, right? When it comes to genocide, and forgive me for going on about this because I feel quite strongly about the terminology as well. When it comes to genocide as well, what we have today is a situation in which we prosecute individuals, right, for the commission of crimes. All international criminal tribunals and courts can only prosecute individuals. The only exception is the International Court of Justice, where states can sue each other in that court, right? But the rest is for individuals. And yet, we have very clear rulings. One example is at the ICTY, where the judges have held that an individual cannot commit genocide because a crime of that scale requires others to participate, requires different levels of authority. And so you have something that I see as a bit of a conundrum, if you will, because if we have decisions by judges, which I would agree with, and most people would agree with, that it is, how can one individual, unless of course they are an autocrat in a state, anyways, we could imagine a situation where you could
Sure.
have one individual in charge, but even
Mhm.
then they would need others to commit things on their behalf in order to achieve what genocide is, which is the destruction of a group as a whole, or in part, but with the intent of destroying that group in part, or as a whole. So, in any case, I mean, genocide always terms to me is something that I like to discuss
I
because people always misunderstand it, and
absolutely. I think that the misunderstanding or the lack of full context and history, just history, and the how even rhetoricians continue without the public. What you're tasked to do now is so critical. Absolutely. The question for you today was for the audience because we live in a society in the states here that suffers a tremendous denialism, a genocide denialism of great proportions. And I don't want to tag the rest of the globe onto that because I believe that the rest of the globe had been leading the discourse and the new characterizations always. Sticky as it may come for us indigenous folks, our populations really want characterizations to be nuanced. We want to talk about systems that are practicing genocidal practices, where it is systemic, like you say, and there's a whole union and an orchestrated effort. How do we begin to we started with the indigenous Declaration of Indigenous Rights of Peoples. That's one way to start to open the terminologies and our understandings. But just your time today, I know, is critical for my community. We talk about international law. We talk about the different courts, and we don't understand where an individual or a state might end up. And this is what needs to continue to happen. Also, media. You're
If I can just ask a question right there, because Olga was referring to this conundrum, and I think you just referred to it as how, from the point of view of Indigenous organizing and where to go with certain issues, that indeed seems like a very difficult thing to overcome if you can't either bring a state or an individual to account. Like, how do you address that in an international forum?
you see, you have different levels, right? You just mentioned genocides, which in the past, legally speaking, purely legally speaking, we couldn't technically even call them genocide, right? Because the definition was only adopted in 1949. So we
Mm.
have to differentiate between when we speak about genocide as a concept, which again is part of a legal definition, and has it happened before? Even the Armenian genocide, which is in places as a genocide, right? Is
Mhm.
technically, legally speaking. I'm not trying to be difficult, just want to make that distinction. And again, that is
Right.
not to say that these crimes did not happen and that a genocide did not happen. It did. But nobody could, even if they were alive, they couldn't be held legally responsible for genocide, right? They could be held legally responsible for other crimes that would have been crimes at that time as well. So it doesn't exonerate them in any way. But I'm just saying, technically, we couldn't call what had happened in Namibia, what had happened in different parts of Africa way before the Holocaust, were also, by today's definitions, genocides in different
The
places, right?
Congo.
Or
Mhm.
exactly what's happened in Cambodia, right? Which we all know in the 70s when Pol Pot and his regime decimated, I think by some estimates, 25% of the population, Would you believe that that's not legally considered a genocide, even if it did happen after 1949? Because the definition of the group does not fall under the limited definition that the Genocide Convention gives us, which is national, ethnic, racial, or religious. It was a political group or otherwise defined group that they were trying to eliminate, because he was trying to eliminate anybody who had glasses, because that was proof that there must have been seeing. So this was, you see, so ironically, even after the definition in the Genocide Convention of 1949, something that happened in the 1970s and that is being processed in courts, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia are dealing with these crimes and prosecuting these crimes. Only the extermination of a Chinese minority who perished during that war is technically a genocide. The rest, the killing of 25% of the Cambodian population, is technically not. And again, this is important that people can understand the distinctions. And then to go back to your question as to how we can deal with these past wrongs. Well, what's interesting to me field is that back in the early 90s, when I started this, right, the general attitude was nobody ever is held responsible for this. People commit crimes all the time. We've had the Vietnam War, we've had the Cambodian War, we've had all of these things happening during the, nobody was held responsible. So, by the time the 90s rolled around and the former Yugoslavia erupted, we were all sitting watching these horrible things unfold and expecting nobody will be held responsible, because that was what was happening in the world. But now the question is a very different one. 30 years on, even if, and obviously I'm painfully aware of everything that's going on and horrified at everything that's going on, but even so, people expect justice. People expect people to be held responsible. They're aware of the fact that that's not always going to happen. Same as in a national system, to be honest. When you're talking about even ordinary crimes, well, yes, we're all aware of the many people who get away with it, right? Does that mean that the whole system should be dismantled? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that there will always be some people who will get away with things for different reasons? Yeah, I'm sure there will be. But the fact that there is an expectation now that people should be held responsible, that there are people actively talking about it, that there is even now, some people will argue, well, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has no enforcement mechanism, which is absolutely true, which means that if they issued an indictment against Netanyahu and Gallant, they issued an indictment against the remaining person of Hamas, who's one of the perpetrators of the attack on the 7th of October, but they can't arrest him, right? Putin as well. He's been indicted by the ICC. He doesn't seem to care. And yet he does, because none of them can actually travel as freely as they had been able to up until now. It's a fact of life. Will they always have countries that will give them sanctuary? That's also a fact of life. But the number of those countries is far more limited than would have been the case without an international indictment. Now, is that ideal? No, it's not. But is it important? To me, it's very important. And to me, it's significant, right? The fact that Donald
Is that a new benchmark? I'm sorry, but have we reached, has this ever happened before, that there's been a sort of worldwide consensus is that where does this consensus come from? I guess I'm asking.
That's an interesting question. I would say first of all, from the development of a system that has really grown steadily over the past 30 years, right? So we've had, and this is something I like to repeat to my students because it's very easy to get disillusioned today, particularly, right? Mm-hmm. But I like to tell people, okay, we're talking about human progress. Human progress is not a linear thing. We make progress, but we make progress. Sometimes we go back a couple of steps, but then we go forward another 50 steps. Then we go back maybe a couple of steps and so forth. It goes like it's normal. To me, it's normal. Our lives are like that. We might be very successful in a million different ways, then we'll have some failures. Then we'll have to regroup. We'll have to continue. We will hopefully learn from those failures. This is how I see it. I see in the long arc of the universe, perhaps, that Martin Luther King taught us about. I do believe that it does bend towards justice, as he had said, because people will continue demanding innate. I see it as an innate human feeling. I don't know, expectation, sense. In something that you feel in your bones as a human being. Injustice on a daily basis, on a regular basis.
I agree. Our sense of justice is really deeply, whether we want to believe it or not, in an inheritance of hope. That's a spiritual inheritance, I think, that humans have, and we don't always want to claim it. We want to compact it into something. I love this that you're saying right now, though, that technology has taken us, and I really do spend time with the media arm of this discourse, the young ones that are really asking the question and really opening up that opportunity to speak out, beyond the doors of the courts.
Uh-oh. We lost you, Judy.
We have a bit of a glitch.
That
Judy, we lost you for a minute there. I'm sorry, but could you try to
I'm thinking, okay, let me just say that data and forensics, and I mean it in terms of data, and data is justice, that whole wonderful line is coming through in the truest way for folks who've done this work for as long, who are continuing to teach, and for the new students. Data and forensics, we're unearthing bones, and you're right. These people cannot be. There are countries and states and state-sanctioned atrocity that could never be held accountable. But just that process and acknowledgement from world court. How about that? The forensics are coming. They're horrific, and and we will uncover and recharacterize the measles blankets that were handed out to my people on this continent as a form of genocide. We will get the real numbers one day, and we will know that it was genocide. So we're advancing, and Olga is part of that with the students up under you. That's why I asked the foundational questions today, because I believe we are in tremendous crises. The humanities are. We've lost the humanities. That whole school of thought is really needing teachers like yourself, active folks who, and I want to say this about translation and people who do translation and international law. I want to give you kudos for that, because what a tremendously difficult job that is, coming up through that and then also affecting policy. You get to hear other worlds, other ways of thinking, and you need to bring that forward. So thank you so much, because we need translators to do this work.
Maybe you could define that for us a little more, Olga, what it actually means to be an organization that's dedicated to communicating justice. I just want to say this is Beyond Borders. I'm Martha Cinader, joined in New York, joined by Judy Talaugon in California, and Olga Kavran. Olga, where are you?
I'm currently in Belgrade, in Serbia, which is where I originally hail from, but I haven't really lived here for a very long time. But I'm currently for this month or so, I'm here. But I was recently based in Lebanon, and really fond of that place as well. In terms of your question is a very interesting. So this is all on the back of my experience from international criminal courts, right? I entered the ICTY when I was fairly young, the Yugoslav Tribunal, back in 1997. And indeed, I started with regular translation, as I would call it, as opposed to translating legalese into normal people's language, as I like to say. I just started with regular translation from my own Serbo-Croatian native language into English, which has become my other native language practically. And then I joined the first outreach program at the ICTY, which was the first time any court anywhere really recognized the need to communicate with the public beyond what their decisions have been, because up until that time, that was not an issue with national courts. There were very rigid systems in which national courts communicated with the public. Every now and again, they would issue a press release to announce a judgment, and that was pretty much the end of that. There was not much communication or efforts at communicating by courts. What happened with the Yugoslav Tribunal is when it issued its first judgment back in 1998, the then president, who was a great jurist, is a great jurist, Gabriel Kirk MacDonald, an American judge. She was the president of the Yugoslav Tribunal at the time. She sent a couple of people on a mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina to see the impact of the judgment that had been issued. And when they came back with their report, she was horrified, from what I understand, by the fact that it was no effect at all, practically, because there was the people who the perpetrators had abused, of course, the hold on power to negate the judgment, not to even talk about it, and so forth. And the victims had no other access to information. And so it was she who launched what was later became known as outreach. And this is a specific communication effort on behalf of all international tribunals that has since come online, have all established outreach programs. And that meant that these were communications dedicated specifically to the stakeholders on the ground. So, the Yugoslav Tribunal operated in English and French. These were the only official languages of the court. Nobody speaks English and French in the former Yugoslavia, and certainly not in the villages. I mean, they do, of course, in the cities, same as they do in other places, but in rural areas, and they're just people with their everyday lives, they do not communicate in English and French. And then understanding legal terminology in English and French, I mean, that's another level altogether. And so it was impossible. People did not know could not follow the proceedings properly because they couldn't understand them necessarily. They couldn't they couldn't understand the reasoning of the judgments. And so the point was to find ways, first of all, to start with translating everything and communicating with the media in the local languages. I mean, now it sounds like a no-brainer, but believe it or not, that's where we were back in the 90s. So the ICTY displayed tremendous foresight by even establishing a press office that was functioning in English and French. Don't get me wrong, that was a major achievement to start off with. But then added to that was what came 6 years later, when Gabriel Kirk MacDonald realized that was not sufficient. Even if it was a pioneering effort, it was still not sufficient under the circumstances, and then established the outreach program. That has been repeated now at the ICC, at all the ad hoc tribunals in the meantime. And because it was seen as necessary to tailor the communication. So the idea is not only to issue a press release. No, you have to find ways of reaching you have to find ways of reaching the victims and explaining to them beyond what's in the press release, what was in the judgment, why the judges considered certain facts, dismissed others, to help them understand the written text, because the judgments, again, would always come out in the official languages of the court, which is fine. But even if one of the official languages of the court is a local language, for example, in the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, they rightfully had English, French, and Arabic as the official languages of the court, but it takes time. I don't think the judgment is still translated into Arabic 5 years later, because it's a very long document and it takes a very long time and a lot of resources. And so somebody in the meantime has to be there to be able to explain this in simple language. And so the idea of communicating justice, as I started calling it, because I got my inspiration from the notion that there is such a thing now as science communication, right? Universities have developed programs for students to study called science communication. They have courses on science communication because they've recognized that there is a gap between scientific study and the public at large who needs to understand it, right? So to me, if we have science communication, because we understand that natural sciences are something that an effort needs to be made to communicate with the general public, I see zero difference between
Well,
that.
presumably because it affects our lives, and we need to
Precisely.
know about
Precisely.
science, right? As well as justice. So that's
Precisely. And this is where I draw the parallel, and this is why I use the terminology to sort of build upon what has already been developed. And not it's recent also. I mean, science communication starts in the 70s and 80s as a notion, and only more recently, I think probably after, in this century, as actual courses.
Yes.
In an ideal world.
Profession, really.
Yes. In an
Yeah.
ideal world, I believe personally, for example, that universities that teach law, that teach international law, that teach students who are aiming to go into judicial mechanisms. So not every single student who's studying law necessarily, but people who want to be in judicial mechanisms, whether it's local courts or international courts, I believe they should have at least a semester dedicated to this particular topic.
Agreed. Agreed.
To learn how to communicate, because I always keep saying, so I've been working in outreach since the first outreach program was established at the ICTY, which was in 99/2000. 2000, early 2000, I joined the outreach program. It was established in 99, right? And since then, we have spent, I won't say more time, but we have spent way too much time in what I refer to as in-reach. And that means explaining to the judges and prosecutors why we need to do what we do. Because they came, especially the older generations, right, who were active, at the beginning, they came from an understanding that, especially as a judge, you can't talk about your judgments. It's really against, that's not what you do, right? You write your judgment, you put all of your reasoning in the judgment that you write. Depending on the system, you can write your separate opinion, so you can have your individual say on the matter as a judge, and that, or dissenting opinion even, which again, depending on the system, gets published with the judgment, and that's it. This is what you said. This is how you've decided to say it, and this is what you say, and you have no right as a judge to further comment on your judgment, right? This is the rule. And as a prosecutor, you're not supposed to be talking to anybody at all, because we're talking about an investigation, which is necessarily confidential. Right. That's another thing that people really have a hard time understanding, that it is confidential, and it must be confidential, not only to protect the investigation from nefarious influences, which is one main reason, but also to protect suspects who may not turn out to be the accused. Any investigation might investigate 20 people, of whom 19 have nothing to do with it in the end, but it may have looked like they did. Imagine if all of that was public at all times, right?
The constant concealing of case all along the way exists on the campus community and systems across the board, that want to also, let me go there, defend themselves and protect themselves also. We have tremendous protocol and procedure to also protect the innocent, build a case, give people a chance. But in the light, this is why it's so exciting for me, and I'm not a great communicator today because I'm so excited to have you here, is that on the campus worker and the campus community has suffered tremendously in the last 4 or 5 years. And there's not much dialogue for them to engage in, on an international level, to get to know that, I don't know, a free, prior, and informed consent took a lot, of effort, and came through the folks who could do the work that you just said, that we should have classes and communication and law, international, yes, procedures, every bit of, I will just say, state administration and of the state is procedural, and every pocket, every protocol, the layperson is gone by the third article. And I spend a lot of time explaining that to my elders, not explaining that,
I
but
think there's a
bringing.
lot of that going on in general in this climate we're in right now, where, you're seeing YouTube, Facebook, TikTok videos about what to do if they're banging on your door.
It's wonderful.
And, so I think on that very basic level of your rights in that situation is another example, I guess, of educational justice,
Absolutely.
educating people about justice.
We're
Absolutely.
very fortunate to
That's
have.
a positive. It's a positive development that people are helping. Now the problem is, of course, anybody can record a TikTok video. So when the videos are recorded by people who actually know, great, more power to them. I think that, whatever way works to inform people of their rights, to explain to people important to them, great. The problem is the fact that, and this is where we go back to what the courts must do, right? Because to me, if your audience, if an important audience for you as a court happens to be on TikTok for whatever reason, you've got to be on TikTok. You have to figure out a way to be on TikTok. You can't sit there and say, but TikTok is TikTok and we are a court of law. It doesn't work that way anymore. And so to me, that's another battle that we fought internally. And I have to say, with my colleagues, obviously, there's a couple of dozen people, not more, that are actually doing this line. They're in this line of work because it's a small field. Um, and so, to force these courts, when you look at their websites, you'll find that they have LinkedIn pages, they've got Facebook pages, they've got all kinds of, presence on social media because they have accepted the fact that they must be on social media. More and more courts are producing. For example, we did a project last year as part of JUSTICOM assisting people in Ukraine, among other things, by producing short videos that explain in Ukrainian the definitions of international crimes, so that people, when are talking about what's happening to them,
Brilliant.
they have the terminology. And so, for example, the videos were for particularly for a younger audience, and so the language was adapted to the best of our ability to what we felt that audience can understand, and so forth. And I'm talking about 3-4 minute videos that can, not longer than that, because, or even shorter, I would say 3 maybe minutes, I think 3.5. And these explain basic concepts. So you try to kind of, these are super complex things. And of course, you're going to lose some nuance. There's no doubt about that you're going to lose some nuance. But that's just the way it is, right? And then we've produced different materials. We've produced fact sheets for journalists who might want to take them with, and so on. So it's this kind of work. You simply have to, I don't know, somebody said this, I didn't invent it, I'm repeating it, but I don't know who said it. You have to find your audience where they are. You have to reach them where they are. You cannot constantly make them come to you. That said, as a court of law, you have to maintain a certain level of communication, right? You descend, and this is why courts are inevitably at a disadvantage in these situations, because those who attack their work are always going to be able to say things that a court is never going to be able to entirely and adequately respond to, because you can't go that low in some situations. You just cannot, because so there is that limitation. As a court of law, there are certain things, you try to stay away from something that is too populist, if you want to. I don't know what word to use, but you know what I mean. You don't want to use language that is just inappropriate. You still want to maintain some sort of decorum. And up until I mean, I'm sorry to say, but up until this course that has been adopted by the Trump administration, that level was somehow
Forget
observed
decorum
all,
altogether.
all
Right.
around.
Yeah.
But I hope this is an anomaly which we will survive somehow and then return to what one would consider normal communication between adults. But that's a different
I'm
discussion, I
so
think.
glad. I'm so glad you draw the line and distinction for the audience, and that we know intuitively oftentimes if in TikTok people buy the content, if people are gatekeeping, holding information, not completely revealing in empirical data and judicial data. You're right, if we're not wise enough to know the difference, then that's not your audience. Please, yes, continue to do the proper delivery of this information. I'm for that. I was so excited. That's why I'm so excited that you blended that the courts and law has found a component where folks can really speak to communication and translation and linguistics, can really, for not just today, but have been working on this for 30 years. This is why I love the globe. I love America, but I think that we're at a disadvantage. We have a lot of people who gatekeep information. TikTok is spilling with that. People need to be more discriminating, discerning, and just pick and when introductions are made, I'm an attorney, or I am a retired international specialist, and this is what I've done for many years. Those things matter. So I scrutinize always what I expose my students to. It's really, really difficult, and I'm just so honored and proud of you to be able to. A lot of folks are gatekeepers. They really think that this is information that should remain clandestine, and away from the populace, from the people. So yes, I'm really proud that this is an expanded piece to the courts.
Thank you. But it's also a matter of how you approach the work that you do. There was a period of time when I was obviously speaking on behalf of these courts as a spokesperson, right? And there are questions. So I would always say one thing. For example, it is absolutely inappropriate for a spokesperson for any international judicial or any judicial institution, in my view, to say no comment to any question. That's not an answer. You cannot give that. What you can do, for example, and I've done it a billion times, somebody asks you what's going on in this investigation, and you say, okay, this is what I can tell you. And beyond that, I cannot tell you anything because of this, and that. So there's a reason why I cannot tell you certain things. In all of my years of experience, even the most belligerent journalists, to be fair, I haven't had any dealings with Trump-like people, but I've had dealings with all kinds of the former Yugoslavia, who are very negatively inclined, to put a euphemism on it, to the work of the Yugoslav Tribunal. Even, none of them would ever, once they're explained as to why I'm not providing an answer, the best they would do is they would shrug and walk away. Even they would accept that, because what else can they do? Because the explanation is clear. For example, I cannot discuss people who are currently being investigated because of what I had explained earlier, that it's also for the protection of all the people who are being investigated, not just for the protection of the investigation itself. And once there's somebody indicted, then that indictment will be made public, or there would be an arrest warrant announced, or rather a name would be released to allow for the arrest of the person, but then the indictment would only be released a couple of days later. Again, people would ask questions, you explain why this is happening, and then people accept. And in most cases, if you explain it as a decent human being without confrontation or whatever, people will accept. They won't feel like they're being lied to. They won't feel like they're being gaslighted. They won't feel like they're being swindled in any way, or that information is being deliberately withheld from them, if you explain why you're not telling them certain things. And so, and this, again, because people did used to, sometimes say no comment when they were faced with a question that they technically cannot answer. And I'd be like, no, you can't do that. You can't do that, because then you open the door to all kinds of speculation. What does it mean, no comment? It's not that you don't have a comment, it's that you can't say, or that you don't know. There are many situations in which they would ask me a question to which I simply did not know the answer. And I would say, I do not know. What I can do is, if you give me your deadline, I will ask people who might know and I will come back to you. And again, people are okay with that. People
They're
accept.
okay. They're okay because the culture of information dissemination and media, the audience is already groomed to understand it and not to know it, but let's say journalism. We walk in and it is an overture between the speaker that we're in with the mic in their face and the journalist already know that they need to, there's an overture sometimes. We will get nothing, but we need to do that for the audience and for the network and for the job. You cannot leave the audience hanging, and you should not, like, it's very incendiary now, so it's awful. I realize you must be facing we all avoid the media at this point. It's just it's incendiary, or even just exchange in public. But I do believe that I never used the word overtures between the representatives and media more so now than ever, and respect it, because they are sort of a dance for the public. It can be very coercive and very deceiving, but I believe that we need to get back to some very basics, helping the community find resolve in terms of this. I hear that. That's wonderful. I wanted, Martha, did you have anything else?
Well, I'll interject again to say this is Beyond Borders, and my name is Martha Cinader, and I'm joined by Judy Talaugon in California and Olga Kavran, currently in Belgrade. And Beyond Borders is brought to you by Listen and Be Heard Network. And listen and be heard. I think that's what we're talking about, maybe with international courts on a very basic level. And I think, from my just personal perspective, experiencing the world this morning, one could hope that there might be some way for an international body to have some influence on what's going on in America today. And I just wondered, what do you think, Olga? And is that just like a fantasy, sort of wishful fantasy, that we might get some help internationally to regain, I don't know. When I look at this whole thing, say from the Native American perspective, and what a truly long struggle it is, even now, when we talked about defining genocide, and when people talk about genocide, they don't necessarily think of the Americas first. What can we look for? Is there some sort of international influence that could be brought to bear in the present day situation, where no one seems willing to just say the emperor is insane?
Yeah. Well, that's a difficult one. I'm sorry
Maybe
to
an
say,
impossible one. I don't know, but
I'm sorry to say that you guys are on your own pretty much on this one, because the US has established itself as such a superpower over time, right? It's almost like, you've got a bully in the house who's the strongest one of all, who's going to rein him in, right? So the thing is, I don't see anybody else apart from the American people who can really rein this in. Now, some people will say that what's happening with the administration is obviously a reflection of what's happened in society. The way I see it, and this may be is likely to be very controversial, and feel free to even remove it if necessary. I see all of what's happening as the last throes of a an archaic, patriarchal, um, white supremacist slash with white supremacist with toxic masculinity combination, right? But I think all of that is dying, and these are the last throes of a dying animal. And we all know that these are sometimes the most difficult
Desperate.
and desperate times, because that dying animal will fight and will fight to the death, right? Because it's dying. This is how I see it. And I see it as a process. I see it as a process that inevitably, and when I say dying animal, I just mean the things that should have died a long time ago, like white supremacy, like toxic masculinity. And I'm very precise about that, because I don't see masculinity as an issue. I see toxic masculinity as an issue, right? And patriarchy, and again, in its toxic form, right? I'm not talking about benevolent traditions that people like to stick to. None of that. I'm talking about the toxicity that beats people down. I'm talking about the idea of simply beating people down when they're low, and beating people who are in any case, like the whole thing of attacking migrants, of attacking immigrants, of attacking women, of attacking minorities. I mean, this is beating people down who are weaker to begin with.
Yes.
And this is what I'm talking about when of the things that I think are on their last legs. That's how I see it. Now, it's a process. It is not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a difficult process. A lot of people are going to suffer through that process. I mean, I have a very small analogy to make. Former Yugoslavia, right? The 1990s, we had the wars. Lots of things were happening in different parts of the former Yugoslavia, all of which I'm sure you've seen enough about. One thing that hasn't been reported very much is that at the end of its run, the Milosevic government in Serbia, right, which fell in 2000, in 98 and 99 and 99, it murdered, I think at one point I personally counted, because I personally have a vested interest, having been very close to somebody who was assassinated in that fashion. They assassinated 19 people. So 19 people lost their lives in the last year of Milosevic's power, who the government assassinated. I mean, we don't have proof of that, except for some of them. We do even have judicial proof. For the rest, we just know, even though these cases have never been resolved, but we know who's behind and who did it. And these were the last throes of the government. That's what it was, nothing else. It was his, he understood, or they understood, that they were on their way out.
Yeah.
And they just eliminated people and prolonged, maybe that extended their, tenure by a few months, not more. Or maybe it even precipitated their demise. I don't know. But in any case, it was all happening in the last, part of that. And so this is a small analogy to say that I mean, that's how I see this. Maybe it's my incorrigible optimism and the need to look for the light at the end of any tunnel, and we're definitely in a dark tunnel at the moment. But that's how I see it. And in a way, biology, not just because of people who are in power currently, who are all ancient, but biology is inevitable. They will go. Look at the younger generations. That's another thing. I have to take another example from this part of the world. I don't know if you've had a chance to see, but young people in Serbia have been protesting for over a year now. And in great numbers and in a very sustained way. And what is most fascinating to me about that is these young people have a moral compass based on what they fight for, based on why they're fighting, based on how they're fighting, based on the values that they're promoting in their fight. They have a stronger moral compass than any generation I've seen in the last 3 decades. They got it somewhere. I don't know where they got it. I even talked to my friends whose children are in the protest, because we're old enough to have, college school kids, right? And so I speak to my friends and they're like, I don't, a friend of ours who has two twin boys who are 17 and who are super involved in the protest. She herself, she said, listen, I have no clue. I know that my boys didn't read a book, except for the books that they absolutely had to read for school. It's not like they're well read, They picked up their understanding of the world somewhere, and they did it well. They picked up the idea that they must fight for themselves. They fight relentlessly in a way that their old mom was like, a year ago, if you told me that this is what they would be doing, I would be telling you they're not interested. All they care about is their, friends and their, whatever games and I don't know what. And she says, and I would have been wrong. So there is hope. There's great hope. I see great hope in that because you see kids and you're like, wow, they can do something. It's going to take time, but at the end of the day, they can do it. They can do it.
Yes, they have been witness to some things that we've compacted and we've packed away, and they've been witness to some things worldwide that normally, and this might be even global, just our generation. I'm older than you, and you're probably my oldest son's age, and we've compacted a lot of uncomfortable and inconvenient realities for such a long time, and that was the inheritance that a lot of my older child got. And it's just a matter of, and what an amazing being we are to be able to recover and restore our balance again. You see it through the children. That's the hope, that if they can walk through a witnessing, and they have witnessed babies being stolen in other countries, America. This is, I say, this is how I receive my students, is I know that they've seen something that I was spared as a child. And I'm an Indigenous child, raised an activist. And so I'm so pleased that at this point, it is brutal. There are atrocities left and right. In plain sight in the United States, there are murders. And, I just feel like, is there anything that you would like to share with students that are entering, and graduates as well, that are really thinking about your field of study across the board? Is there anything you would like to share with them? Period.
Sure. Well, I think the point that I made earlier is back in 1993, sitting in the former Yugoslavia, watching the atrocities unfold. It seemed absolutely hopeless. Nobody to stop them, nobody to hold them accountable. Well, in the end, somebody did stop them. Late, we know that, but they were stopped, and a lot of people were held accountable. So I would say that this is something that this is a peer. So we've had a tremendously positive development in terms of international criminal law, international criminal justice for the better part of the last 30 years. Right now, it seems like we're at best stagnating, at worst, taking a few steps back. But if we have taken 50 steps forward, and we now take a few steps back, it does not mean that the forward motion cannot be resumed. And I strongly believe that it will be. I strongly believe that some of the wrongs, I mean, like you mentioned the younger generations and how, the different world that they live in. First of all, the internet, with all of its negatives, is generally a positive thing and opens their minds. So kids now, in the middle of Belgrade, there is an exchange of cards of K-pop stars. Belgrade teenagers, there's a little subculture of K-pop fans in Belgrade. I think that's fabulous, right? Who knew about Korea in my,
Arts uniting people from
that's
disparate.
Fabulous. Whether I like K-pop is irrelevant. It's fabulous that there is like a little subculture of K-pop fans, and I'm sure there's subculture of other different trends that are halfway around the world. In the same way, these kids have seen more of the world through their screens than I have in my lifetime, even though I like to consider myself both well-traveled and well-educated. But they've seen more. And they, I think, understand more. They've seen, as you say, more depravity than we ever have. I grew up in a sheltered childhood until the wars. I was sheltered. Of course, I was aware of the injustice. The former Yugoslavia was a lot about, the non-aligned movement and the various colonial things and all that. So we did grow up learning about these things in that system. But I was still in a very sheltered environment as compared to what these kids see. And when you even see what's going on with the genocide in Palestine, right? I grew up with the story of the Holocaust, as well I should have done, and I learned it very well. And in my mind, I grew up with the Jewish people as victims, which they undoubtedly have been and still are to a certain extent, and with Israel as a state that gained in strength, but it still didn't figure in the forefront of my mind as a superpower of any description. Kids who are now, say, I don't know, 25, right? Not even kids anymore. Young people who are now 25, who are now 30, in their lifetime, Israel is a very powerful state, the most powerful in its region, with the biggest army in its region, with the most powerful ally on the planet, able to violate any international law rule that it chooses to violate and answer to no one. So they have a very different perception. This is not to say that the Jewish people have not been victimized and that this pertains to the Jewish people as such, because it does not. It pertains to Israel as a regime and a state. Same as, in when we had a genocidal regime in Serbia, right? But it's a fact of life that for these younger people, younger generations, obviously figures very differently in their psyche than it does for the older generations, right? In a way. So, they have a different perception because they live in a different time. Right?
Yeah. I sat in on a conference and talk about young. These are some young scholars from Holyoke in the East, New England, and this one presentation was on deviant behavior, but it was flipped around. I'm older, so for me, it was flipped around, and that what lies in prison are not the deviants, but what holds them, what contains is what is deviant. And now we get to see what is deviance. We get to see it in plain sight. Talk about sheltered. I'm just
If there's anything we can say is good about all this, it's probably that it's sort of exposed a lot of what lies underneath, I think. And I hate to say it, but we've been talking for about an hour, and I want to thank you both, Olga Kavran and Judy Talaugon. Olga, how can people find out more about your work or get in touch with you?
Please do, yes.
I'm on these various social media platforms, so easily reachable there. I'm also reachable through my email at olga.kavran@justicom.org if anybody wishes to get in touch. And please
We'll
do.
put all that on our website at listenandbeheard.net. This is Beyond Borders. And I have one more quick question for you, if you wouldn't mind just improvising a phrase with the words "listen and be heard."
Improvise a phrase, huh?
Or just what you think of, what that brings to mind.
Listen and be heard. I think we do not do enough listening. And I think that we need to learn, and I speak to myself as much as to anybody else, that we need that the focus would be on listen. I think we have the tools at our disposal to be heard, and we have to use those wisely. But really, the focus would be to listen, to learn how to listen and understand where people are coming from so that we bridge these various divides and we cross over from our various silos, because I think that's another danger that we've put ourselves in.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for that, Olga Kavran from the, I'm sorry, JUSTICOM. Am I saying that right?
Yes,
Are
you
we,
are.
we
Do
are?
you want me to explain
JUSTICOM.
where do you know where the name comes
Sure,
from?
sure.
Justicum is because justitia is justice in Latin. Com comes from comunicando, which is also communications in Latin. And for some reason, I just like the idea of putting together this non-existent word, if you will, combined from these two.
That's wonderful. Justice Communications. I get it.
And surrounded by poets. Please keep us posted for any convening, any opportunity to hear you speak and teach. I'm definitely going to be in contact. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so
You
much for joining us here on Beyond Borders. I'm Martha Cinader for Judy Talaugon and Olga Kavran. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really an honor and a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Well, we hope to have you back soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.